witness some incredible musical and poetic magic with two absolute masters of their crafts joining forces into what's going to create quite an unbelievable experience for you. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Joel Becktell.
Hey, hey, hey.
So Carla and I were on the phone, and she told me that we were doing a Bach, Bukowski, and Brown event, but I'm only responsible for the Bach. So, and I'm leaving the Bukowski and Brown in very capable hands. By the time Bach died, he was completely obscure. He was unknown except by a few people who knew that he was responsible for the training of the really famous musicians who were in Europe at the time, who were his sons. And so he was not known so much for the music he produced at that time, but for the musicians he produced. And his music just plummeted into obscurity when he died. He was very much a local composer and performer, and worked most of his career for the Lutheran Church. And because virtually none of his music was published, it just faded away. And it wasn't until he had been dead for several generations already that the idea that his music was really worth preserving started to motivate some people who started a club called the Bach Society. And their goal was to amass enough manuscripts of Bach's works that they could publish everything they could find. And in fact, when I was a student at the Cleveland Institute of Music, there was a set of shelves maybe this big, and all the way across from one end to the other, there was nothing but the collected works of Johann Sebastian Bach from this 19th century edition. And so there were these music detectives going around trying to find manuscripts that were music by Johann Sebastian. And among those works were the 6 suites for cello. And that huge, long shelf full of books, the 6 suites were probably in volume 30 or something like that. And they took a dozen pages or so, because they're just a single line. And they didn't attract a whole lot of notice at first. When Schumann found them, he was part of this Bach Society. Mendelssohn, Schumann, Brahms, all these guys were subscribers. He said, "That's weird, somebody's lost the piano part to these cello suites." So he wrote one. And it's still, you can still sometimes find that. But the fact that the suites went, in fact, nobody knows for whom they were written. Nobody knows when or if or by whom they might have been premiered. Probably written around 1720 or thereabouts. And it was around 1820 that the first published edition came out. So imagine all the time that passed. And we think, well, 1720 is a long time ago, and 1820 is also a long time ago. Therefore, it's kind of like the same time. But so much had changed stylistically between the era when Bach wrote the suites and the era when they were rediscovered. So you could almost say that the suites took yet another century or more even to be fully rediscovered. And I think maybe more on that particular topic before we play the second suite. But the discovery required to find out more or less what Bach was after, to me, got a big jump start when I realized that you could find. A friend of mine had done a Fulbright in the Czech Republic, and it was one of the libraries in the town where she went that one of the manuscripts, the remaining manuscripts of the Bach suites, not in Bach's own hand, but copied by somebody else. Bach's is lost. But she photocopied it. She put that manuscript on a photocopy machine and copied it, brought it back, and I made a photocopy of her photocopy. And it was one of the most treasured items in my possession for many, many years, until it was actually eventually, after the end of the Soviet Union, these manuscripts were recollected and were published in facsimile. That was a big help, but really the thing I think that made it so that I started feeling like I got the Bach suites and figured maybe I had some clue as to what Bach wanted was when I started playing them on a Baroque cello. The cello itself has so many of the secrets and answers to the questions of what Bach might have meant when he wrote certain things. And so I'm going to be playing the first two suites on this cello tonight. Bach, as I said earlier, he mostly worked for the church, the Lutheran church. He was a cantor, which means he played the organ and he conducted the choir, and mostly he was playing music that he was either making up on the spot or that he had written, and he was conducting music that he had written. Busy, 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 busy man. When he wasn't working for the church, he sometimes fought a little bit with his employers at the church. So he said, I'll show you, and he went to work for a prince. And at that time, he stopped writing liturgical music altogether. But I think that his inspiration never faltered. In the time of Bach, he and the other composers of his generation didn't consider themselves to be artists. They thought that they were craftspeople. And in Bach's own case, he felt that he was, in a certain sense, divinely inspired. Which is to say, he was inspired by the desire to aid the worship of the people who were listening to his music by representing the universe as he and all good Lutherans saw it, which is as an ordered place. A place where if you get the right perspective on it, you stand far enough away or you look at it from the right angle or in the right light, everything goes together perfectly. Maybe not from one second to the next, but when the whole thing is taken into account, you have perfect form, perfect order. And when Bach signed his manuscripts, he usually wrote out or the abbreviation, Solo Dei Gloria. Only God deserves glory. And I think that he wasn't being pious. I think he was really just saying, if I got it right, it's because I was copying a better craftsperson. What we thought we would do tonight in presenting these suites is to play them piecemeal. So I will play a movement at a time. Each suite has 6 movements, a prelude and 5 stylized dance movements. And in between the movements, we're going to hear poetry, and you'll get an idea of why that poetry is going, where it's going, when you hear it, and when you hear it described.
So I did not know that Bach collaborated with Prince. That is really cool. I missed the definite or indefinite article. With Prince, wow, that's amazing. So, what do you do, Bach, Bukowski, and Brown? What do you do with an old misanthropic soul who was misogynistic, chauvinistic? Bukowski, who I often refer to as the dirty old man of American letters. What do you do with him? I feel like that the people who simply say that he was a dirty old man and was awful and was just misogynistic and all these things, which I am not going to defend those aspects of his life. But we were talking earlier about, Bach's the thought of when you stand back and you look at art collectively. Bukowski was as much a mystery as Bach was. We know so little about Bach, really. Like you said, anecdotally, we know little about him, actually. And that there are these mysteries, there are these mysteries. And Bukowski actually wrote highly sensitive, thoughtful, meaningful poems about his daughter. A poem that I'll read for you probably later on this evening called Bluebird. He wrote a poem to a bluebird that lives inside him. This is not the image that people have of Bukowski. Where I wanted to begin with tonight in introducing is I just a few days ago I wrote an ode to Bukowski. Not actually even really thinking about this evening. I wrote a very brief ode to Bukowski. And so I'm going to begin my introduction to this poet and discussing why it is that I loved him and the influence that he had on me with this. Bukowski, for making it okay to be myself by being so much worse. For showing me that PhDs mostly just know a lot more about one or two things and often sacrifice by knowing a lot less about the stuff that makes life bearable. I have a PhD too, Carl. So I'm killing myself. For so many books that read like ice cream. I know they're bad for me, but God, I love them. For lines like, angels are flying low tonight with burning wings. And love breaks my bones and I laugh. You were the unforgivable, chauvinistic prophet stoned by the city gates for the rest of us who are just as unredeemable. And then in an earlier book, I'm going to read one more quickly here, a book called To Sing Hallucinated, First Thoughts on Last Words. So this is a book where every poem in the book is devoted to a famous person's last words. It begins with Socrates and works its way all the way up through John Denver. So I covered a very responsible scope of history. But the penultimate poem in the book is for Charles Bukowski. And the title of the poem is Charles Bukowski's Gravestone. Says nothing but, don't try. That's it. Charles Hank Bukowski, don't try. And it's a rock that's flat in the ground. He doesn't even have a headstone. It's just one little flat stone out there in Palos Verdes at the southern end of the bay in California. Here's the poem that I wrote to his gravestone. Charles Bukowski's gravestone. He died in 1994. Don't try. To spend even a minute pondering what he might have meant would be to ignore his advice. Tricky bastard, that Bukowski. So forget about him. He's dead. Which would also be his advice if ghosts were prone to giving it. And his epitaph does remind me of something Dad told me long ago, right after a more than upstanding deacon stormed out of his study at the church in a thick cloud of righteous indignation. Man, that guy is going to overshoot heaven As sure as heck. one of the things I want to do tonight is introduce you to a couple of reincarnations of Bukowski. They exist. The first one I want to introduce you to is John D. Graham, who is an Austin singer-songwriter who's fairly well known here. And John D. Graham is definitely one of the reincarnations of Bukowski. If you this book over on the table, if you'll look closely at his picture, maybe during the break or something, you'll even just see what I mean. This is a guy who has walked a rough road. I've known John D. for quite a while. He's a very interesting guy, and but he and I both have a mutual love for Bukowski. And we would often at the back, the back of the Continental Club after one of his concerts or something, we would always be quoting Bukowski to each other and laughing about it. So I approached him about an idea. I said, songwriters co-write all the time. Why don't poets do that? Well, I have a theory of why poets don't, and that's because they're a bunch of misanthropic, just a bunch of, shy, I don't want to, hermits. That don't really want to interact with other people. And I said, why don't we do a book of co-written poems? And so here's how it came about. First of all, the title of the book is Bukowski's Gravestone, Don't Try. The other thing about it is that the title to every poem in the book is a line from Bukowski. And John D. and I would take turns writing to, and in response to that line from Bukowski. Some of the poems we would each just write our own poem, okay, in response to that title, but some of the poems, the lines intersperse. So what I did was that John D. and I each have our own font, so you always know who is speaking by the font that's on the page. So I want to read the trickiest one first. This is hard because it just goes back and forth constantly. And so what I will try to do, this is the Bukowski line of this poem is every time my toilet flushes. This will be John D. Graham, and this will be me. Do you understand? Okay, so it's kind of hard, because we do bounce back and forth. So, was this John D?
Yes.
Okay, so it starts with me. Every time my toilet flushes, Lake Thunderbird drops another inch. Someone somewhere thinks of their grandfather. They can hear it, Bukowski says. I wait there a minute or two and then jiggle the handle. I feel like I've lost yet another part of me. Every time my toilet flushes, some small voice I can't stand says, "What now?" I remember the day I deposited my dissertation in the bowels of the library. It's easier to pretend there are no consequences. Every time my toilet flushes, I think of her last words to me. This was my response to the Bukowski title, All My Critics. It's best to remember who's the bull here and who's the matador in the blood sport of words. I can throw up more capes in your face than you will ever care to charge as I slowly wear you down to dust with my footwork and lances. The game, like roulette, is designed for you to lose. Anyway, happy snorting, and I look forward to your next review. So the book, one of the conditions on the book is that John D. Graham would not allow for blurbs. He did not want blurbs. He thought they were disingenuous and written mostly by people who have not actually read the book. Which I'm afraid in the publishing industry might be true. And so let's not get into it. So I finally figured out something. I said, Johnny, I have an idea. I want you to find the worst 2 or 3 sentences that you have ever received as in a review from a magazine or publication. And we will make those the blurbs on the back cover. And he went, hell yeah! I already even know which one it is. And he sent me this within 2 minutes. He emailed this. I wanted you to hear John D. Graham's blurb that he sent for the back cover of the book. It's from New Music Express, which is a big time kind of a folk singer-songwriter out of London. It's a big magazine out of London, New Music Express. in the UK. And this was his review from NME. NME. That just happens to be the initials of New Music Express. John D. Graham, yet another artist from Texas, shows us all the many ways a guitar can be made to sound like a train. Yawn. High praise. So John Dee's response to the Bukowski title, Church is Over. So as Joel mentioned, Bach had a little bit of a tumultuous relationship with the church. And another thing I love about Bukowski and Bach, Bach was, he wasn't born in Leipzig, but he spent
He spent a lot of his
professional life was in Leipzig, which was in eastern Germany. And Bukowski was born in Andernach. So I love the fact that Bukowski was born on the other side of the tracks in western Germany over here. And it took, by the way, I think it took him well over 50 years to eventually finally visit his hometown. Bukowski went back to Andernach, Germany, and it was a very moving experience for him. Here is John Dee's response to the Bukowski title, Church is Over. Remember, this is John Dee, not me, because I am a Baptist preacher's kid. And I have a certain, it didn't work out. I've gotten a lot of counseling now, and I'm doing better. Church is over. before I'm even dressed. So y'all just go on and start without me. Most of my weeks I've been up all night arm wrestling Satan and arguing with God anyway. So by the time morning services roll around, I've pretty much done all the heavy lifting and said my piece already. I can't figure out how you church folk can squeeze in everything that needs to be said and sworn and done and undone in less than 2 hours on a Sunday morning. And last time I went, it mainly seemed to be a bunch of uncomfortable people wearing uncomfortable clothes, sitting on uncomfortable benches, sweating out an uncomfortable silence. I had just about decided that the silence was the best part, but by then, church was over. The second reincarnation of Bukowski I wanted to introduce you tonight is Ezra E. Lipschitz. There's a trilogy of books that my little publishing company is putting out this summer. 2 of them are out. The third one is due out in August. The first book in the series is called I Shouldn't Say, the mostly unedited poems of Ezra E. Lipschitz. And this is just too crucial to the story, so here's just a couple of quick paragraphs from the introduction to the book. This is how Ezra and I met. There comes a time in every vagabond's life when he finds himself sitting at the bar in Maria's on a cold Santa Fe night, hoping to be left alone by the old man sitting next to him. And since the old man's body language indicates that he is as much a misanthrope as you ever were, things go well. So you get through the first drink without incident, but halfway through the second, you can't stop noticing that the old guy is drinking scotch. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. But this is Maria's. Maria's of Santa Fe, where they have a separate special menu with over 100 margaritas on it. So how can you not start saying to yourself at some point, what the hell? And there you have it. That's how I met Ezra Lipschitz, or EE, as I call him when I want to piss him off. Or, as I call him when he starts referring to me as the laureate, usually with raising his pinky in the air away from his almost empty glass of scotch, which is the only amount of scotch I've ever seen in Ezra's glass. There's a lot more to this story. It's a crazy thing. Ezra is a hermit who lives in the mountains of far southern Colorado on the western side, down north of Chama in New Mexico, so close to the border in this whole Chromo area. He wouldn't want me to tell you exactly where because he would kill me if I did. And so he is a hermit and really. And he gives a recipe for what creates the hermit. The recipe. Hermits are not born hermits. Hermits are made, like any casserole, by the slow baking of many ingredients. 1, throw in a few lawyers, sliced carrots, and pock-faced supervisors. Then add a couple of ex-wives along with a girlfriend who didn't quite boil the family's pet rabbit on the kitchen stove, but you know what I mean? 2, stir in the noodles of every idiot who has ever texted on eyes 5 and 95 in the broken heart of rush hour. 3, toss in a can of pea-brained redneck wannabes who carry assault rifles into Walmarts, and then sprinkle on top every fried onion who's writing scripts out in Hollywood. 4, put it in a baking dish, set it in an oven, 350 degrees for as long as it takes. 5, pour a fishbowl glass of wine, maybe a nice Cabernet Franc, and pour as many as it takes. And at the very end, switch to broil until everything is blackened on top. Take it out, set it aside, let it cool until it's cold and hard.
So Maria's, that restaurant with 100 margaritas, is next door to the executive offices of the Santa Fe Symphony, which I was until about a week ago a member of the board of directors.
Is that on the square?
No. It's across the street from Trader Joe's.
So the symphony has a lot of alcoholics, I guess.
Well, what I was going to say is my very favorite part of visiting the symphony offices is just how good it smelled, being next to Maria's.
I love it so much.
Really the only part I liked about it.
So to continue with Ezra, one of the connections that Ezra and I actually made is that we both have daughters. His daughter is 10 years older than mine, and we have both just decided to be honest, because as the book reads, it becomes clear anyway that both, one of the connections that we made, and by the way, Ezra is not his real name. I hope you understand. Like I couldn't use his real name on the books. Writers know how all this works. But both of our daughters happen to be survivors of sexual assault, and that was actually the solidifying of our relationship, to be honest, and how he and I connected on the deepest level. And so I'm gonna read one poem here from Ezra. Story about his daughter. It's also a Santa Fe poem, but I'm not going to reveal the restaurant, and it was not Maria's. To the three ladies in the nice restaurant who glared at my daughter. It takes generations of well-attended breeding to create the precision of your contempt. It takes genetic hubris to conquer God's legions and recreate his world and all its inhabitants in your refined image. And who does not admire the amount of dead weight you carry for the cause? Her dreadlocks, tattoos, and septum ring had to be properly appraised so that the correct tax could be levied. Timeless and relentless work. So it's no wonder you couldn't find the time to get your roots touched up to match the fading copper dye in your thinning hair. Someone's got to stand a post, and you did it well over the tops of your faux diamond spectacles and 3 matching glasses of Rudera Chenin Blanc. Therefore, stand tall, ladies. The world sadly recognizes and sort of respects the balance you bring to the other side of the scales of beauty, freedom, creativity, and vibrant individuality. So I'm quickly going to read a pair, 2 poems that go together. It's some holiday poems. They're to the tune of "O Come All Ye Faithful." But it is Ezra, so be forewarned. The first poem is "Oh, Relax All Ye Liberals." I'm going to be honest with you. A part of the reason that Ezra actually consented to these books he has never published before, the reason that he consented was because of the Trump election. So I am just going to tell you the truth, and there it is. That is the only reason. There came a time, and he said, "Now is it. I can no longer be silent." Oh, relax all ye liberals. Relax, ye liberals, and add a little eggnog to your pint glass of rum. Rearrange the manger scene a little. Make Mary a shepherd. Maybe slide a wise man to the left and give baby Jesus a third father. Top the tree with your smiling Bernie Sanders angel. Pause thoughtfully, then light him up. Take a few deep breaths. Yes, the election is over, but Santa can work around even the craziest set of elves the world has ever seen, making toys in the Capitol workshop. At the same time, do remember, it will take all the faith you've got to make this sleigh fly. Pair poem. Oh, settle down, all ye conservatives. Settle down, ye conservatives. You got all you wanted for Christmas. Well, not all. You're still holding out for that bright red dual-can beer hat with the long plastic straw that says "Made America Great Again" between the cup holders. We understand that you're excited. But as with all shiny new blow-up dolls with wild hair and orange faces, we give you about a year before the luster and bluster wear off, until he won't hold all the hot air you can sputter into his leaky valve, and you finally just leave him, abandoned and mostly deflated, out overnight in a rainstorm, and just never bother to go and retrieve him from the mud.
This is also a pair. This is a pair of dances that the first one comes backing in. It's a set of minuets.
No, we'll just do, well, I'll read a few and then we'll do the piece and then we'll take a little break and then come back and do again for those. And by the way, I do want to recommend that you stick around for the second set, because in the second set, I'm going to read for you John D. Graham's 7 rules for the starving artist that are really more just guidelines. And you do not want to, it's the cliffhanger. I got to tell you, it might be one, do you agree, Carla? It might be one of the most unbelievable things I've ever heard in my life. 7 rules for the starving artist that are really more just guidelines. So Ezra's direct connection to Bukowski. There's a poem in, this is the second book in the Ezra Lipschitz series. It's called Ars Poetica, and it is not misspelled. It's just thanks to the Brits for giving us the perfect version of this book. Ars Poetica, and by the way, the very first poem in the book reads, "Dear reader, though it does not exist, common knowledge still somehow dictates that a poet should never address the reader directly. It also manages to state that a poet should never write poems about poems, poetry, or especially other poets. And so it is with a strange and uncharacteristic delight that I offer you, the reader, an entire book that goes against that good advice." Basically, I don't know how else to describe it. This is Ezra Lipschitz basically just absolutely reaming academia. And it is pretty fun. The poem I want to read you that has a direct to Bukowski is, the title of the poem is, "What Would Bukowski Do?" At some reading in a bar just off campus grounds that I stupidly offered to do, a wiry-headed, tweed-jacketed old academic whose poems died decades ago came up, martini in his right hand, and slurred through spit, "Man, all you have to do to make that one poem work is..." And he followed with this, that, and some other pedantic thing. And so I scratched down a few hard mental notes, you know, so when it comes time to revise it, I could avoid every damn suggestion. And then I busted a beer bottle over his head. With Ezra, probably true. By the way, apparently Bach had a street scuffle as well.
He lost.
And he lost, which Bukowski was famous for as well, losing in his bar fights. And so back to the first book, I shouldn't say. Last things. When the world ends, we'll all be watching TV and probably won't bother to get off our ass and go outside to see what the commotion is all about. President Trump will push a shiny red button because he thinks it's cool that he can now. And we'll all be shocked by how much louder the apocalypse is than the Super Bowl halftime commercials. But oh hell and oh well, our team was losing anyway. So one last corn chip dunked in this store-bought cheese dip before one last sip of Bud Light, and it's kissed this world goodbye. If you haven't noticed, there's a little bit of a Trump theme with Ezra. It is the reason that he wanted to publish the books. And so I'll end on this one. We'll have one more piece, take a little break so you can get more wine, because I found that wine really helps the poetry go down. I suggest beer or wine, either one. And then when we come back later, I'll give you John D's rules that are just guidelines. The last poem I'll read here is now turned to page 842. Well, it took 2 Bibles to swear Donald Trump into the presidency. I've never seen God or great literature put in such a compromising, collar-tugging position. And I had hoped Jesus would make a comeback of sorts by causing them to explode into flames as they were being profaned. But Jesus is apparently more tasteful than I. Besides, he's got the whole turn the other cheek thing he's got to maintain. So, I did all I knew to do, and grabbed my one copy and read for a while back in the pages of Lamentations and Ecclesiastes, where I was comforted by the harsh reminder, it is an unhappy business that God has given to human beings to be busy with. And that's just chapter 1. So raise your right hand and then repeat after me. Vanity of vanities, says the teacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity.
There is wine and beer. There's wine, there's also beer. Just to make sure I'm grammatically correct there. And there are CDs and books. And we're in a bookstore. Do what you do.